Carl, the situation in Europe, the politics, the UK election and Italian election that may well happen at the end of this year. How do you think about the politics in Europe at the moment?
Politics in Europe right now are interesting, and my interest is not so much on the internal politics, but the external relationships that Europe's forming. I'm watching the rise of Angela Merkel, who also is coming up for elections in the fall, and seeing her take a leadership role for Europe and steering Europe possibly in a direction that looks more toward China than to the United States in the absence of a strong bridge with the U.S.
If you're an investor, what does any of this mean for you whatsoever? What do you tell them this morning after a weekend just full of political news once again and fractures over the transatlantic alliance and the volume turned up all the way?
Well, for one thing, I'm making a big shift in my tectonic plates, all right?
Yeah.
I see Europe listening to Angela Merkel, expecting China's Premier Li in Germany first and then in Europe later this week. I'm expecting to see Europe bond more with China and bond more along the Silk Road. And the Silk Route to China opens up 4 billion consumers to trade with Europe. That's a much more lucrative market for European exports than they're going to see trading with the United States. And I think we're seeing a new axis, and I'm advising investors to look at Asia, to look at Central Asia, to look at the emerging economies in there, because that's where I think the growth of the world is going to be moving forward longer term. Shorter term, European economy is still a mess. That's not going to change. But anything beyond the shorter term, I think there's more source for optimism this morning than we've seen before.
So, Emad, what is your view on this? Do you see a China pivot by Europe, not by the United States, by Europe now? Certainly President Xi has been courting Europe, Eurasia, as part of the One Belt, One Road. Do you see a long-term strategic shift here in the cards?
I mean, look, ultimately, most of the growth in the world is from Asia, it's from China, it's from India. These are the drivers of long-term growth. However, I think we can sometimes leap ahead here. The economic ties between Europe and the US are still incredibly strong, and it'll be a long time before we see any type of trade protectionism there. Similarly, NATO, although we have had a lot of talk from Donald Trump trying to push more spending and for them to take more of a role going forward, it's an incredibly strong alliance. Those aren't just going to change overnight, but definitely on a structural basis, the move is towards Asia.
So what about in the shorter or medium term? If you're Angela Merkel right now and you're saying the things that she is saying right now, what do you want out of the United States? What do you want to change in what President Trump is doing or saying?
Well, I think you want President Trump to back down or at least show some support towards his traditional allies. I mean, we all understand Trump basically puts a very firm initial offer in any type of negotiation. It appears that's what he's doing here. But ultimately, this is undermining a lot of his allies. And from Angela Merkel's point of view, I think she really needs to take the lead now in Europe. The election of Macron has given her some support. But, you know, as you discussed in the previous segment, elections are coming up, and she needs to be shown. Actually, basically, she needs to show strong and stable leadership in Europe, ironically.
Emad, I'm not sure that slogan was going to work for Chancellor Merkel. It hasn't worked too well over in the UK. Carl, we're looking at the situation. John Crine of Deutsche Bank commenting on the so-called beer tent speech, calling it a real keynote, that the Merkel speech is recognition Europe must pull together. If this is more than just a domestic story, more than just saying I'm a strong leader, more than just saying I'm a Europhile to kind of push Mr. Scholz to one side ahead of that election, what can she do together with France that she's failed to do over the last decade in Europe?
Well, I think, you know, that's a tough one, because unifying Europe is one of these things that does not have a short-term answer. I think we have to look back at our own history in the United States and recognize that it was decades before the Confederation of States actually started working together as a union, formed a common monetary policy, unified the different colonies into one nation. So I think of Europe as kind of a nation in building, under construction, and she has to supervise that process as clearly as possible.
Yeah.
There's not going to be a short-term solution here, but if you're going to be an investor looking for a 10 or a 20-year horizon, I think she has an opportunity now to rally Europe behind her into a movement that opposes the grassroots nationalism, opposes breaking it all apart, and supports pulling it together.